On Christmas Eve, a frozen widow and her baby begged for shelter at his door. The wood was wet. That's what I remember first. I'd split a whole cord that afternoon, stacking it under the lintel before the sky got that particular gray, the gray that has weight to it, the gray that means business, and still about half of what I brought inside was damp enough to fight me. I was on my knees in front of the hearth with a tin of pine shavings and a disposition I won't pretend was good, coaxing a fire that didn't want to be coaxed, when the knock came. I didn't move right off. It was Christmas Eve, which meant nothing to me that year except that Denton's store would be closed 2 days running, and I'd forgotten to pick up a second bag of coffee. A man knocking on my door on Christmas Eve in the middle of a blizzard was either lost or trouble, and I wasn't sure which was worse. The knock came again, 3 times, not hard, more like a hand that didn't have much left in it. I set down the shavings tin and stood up, pulled my coat off the peg by habit even though I was going maybe 8 feet to the door, opened it. The cold hit me first, then I saw her. She was standing in the blue dark just off the porch step, a bundle pressed against her chest, her face so pale it looked carved. Snow in her hair. No hat. A coat that might have kept a woman from freezing in October, but it was not October, and the wind coming down off the ridge that night had teeth in it. She was shaking, not the little shivering a body does to warm itself, but the deep, autonomous kind where a person can't stop and couldn't tell you their own name without concentrating. She said something, I couldn't hear it, the wind was that bad. I stepped out onto the porch, which I should tell you is something I do not do casually. I am not a man who welcomes the world onto his property without thinking it through. I spent enough years where opening a door without thinking cost you something, cost you a horse, cost you a friend, cost you the peace you'd built out of nothing in the years after. But I stepped out. I said, "What?" She said it again, "Please." That was the whole of it, just that word. The bundle moved, I looked down. There was a baby in that coat with her, tucked in against her chest under the flap, and the baby's face was turned up at me like it was waiting on some kind of verdict. I said, "Get in the house." Her name was Clara Marsh. She told me that after I sat her down near the hearth, which had finally caught while I was out, and gave her a blanket and poured the last of the coffee into a cup and put it in her hands. She held the cup the way a drowning person holds a rope, not drinking, just gripping, letting the warmth travel up her palms. The baby was a girl. 4 months, she said. Her name was Rose. I didn't ask a lot of questions right then. You could see the woman was still somewhere far off inside herself, still out in the dark and the cold, still surviving instead of arrived. I put another log on, got the other blanket from the chest at the foot of my bunk and laid it over her shoulders. She looked up at me when I did that, and there was something in her face, not gratitude exactly, more like surprise, like she had not been expecting simple kindness and didn't quite know where to put it. Rose was awake and watching everything with those big dark eyes babies have, the eyes that see the whole world as equally extraordinary. The fire, the ceiling, my face, all of it the same measure of astonishing. I pulled a chair to the far side of the hearth, not crowding her, and sat. After a while Clara said, "My husband is dead." I said, "I'm sorry." She said, 3 weeks now, the fever, it was fast. I didn't say anything to that. She said, "I was trying to get to my sister in Harlow. She's the only family I have left. I hired a man with a wagon. He'd said he knew these hills, but when the storm came on, he turned back. He turned back and left me on the road. He said he couldn't risk the horse." I said, "How far out?" She said, "I don't know. I walked. I followed the fence line." I said, "That's about 4 miles. She looked at me. I said, "You walked 4 miles in this with a 4-month-old. She didn't say anything. She looked down at Rose and then back at the fire, and I got the sense she was only now beginning to understand what she'd just done, what her legs had done without her permission, because there was no other choice. I said, "You're not going anywhere tonight." She said, I know. I said, or tomorrow the way this looks, maybe the day after. She nodded. Rose made a sound, not crying, just a sound, and Clara shifted her, murmured something down at the top of her head. I looked away, gave them that. I got up and went to the kitchen end of the cabin and started thinking about what I had. It was an inventory I hadn't run in a while because I generally don't need much. Bacon, dried beans, half a sack of cornmeal, a wheel of hard cheese I'd been making last, a smoked venison shank hanging from the rafter, jarred peaches from the summer. Not what you call a feast, but I'd fed myself through worse winters on less. I got the beans soaking and started the bacon, and thought about nothing except what order to do things in, which is a way I've always calmed myself down. You put your mind on the next step. You don't think about the woman at your hearth or her dead husband or the baby or what any of it means. You think about whether the beans need more water. She was asleep when I brought the food, sitting straight up in the chair with the baby against her chest and her head dropped sideways, the blanket pulled up to her chin. The coffee cup had tipped in her hand just barely, a dark spot on the blanket, and she'd slept right through it. I set the plate on the hearthstone where it'd stay warm, stood there a minute. The fire was good now. The wet wood had caught after all once it had time, and the cabin was warm in a way it hadn't been in weeks, months maybe. I live alone. I have lived alone for a long time. The cabin is warm enough for one man doing what one man does, and I had let things go in ways you don't notice until someone else is there. The cold draft from the south window that I'd been meaning to chink since September. The pile of harness, leather on the table I'd been sorting for a week. The particular emptiness of a place where no one is ever expected. I noticed all of it standing there. I took the harness off the table and piled it on the floor near the door, wiped the table down with a rag. It was stupid. She was asleep, it was near midnight, no one was going to see the table, but I did it anyway. I went to my bunk and lay down with my boots on, and listened to the blizzard work on the roof and walls. That sound like the whole world wanting in, and I lay there a long time before I slept. Rose woke me, not crying, that same sound again, a kind of interested commentary on being awake. Then Clara's voice, low and steady, answering it. I opened my eyes and the cabin was gray light. Early. The storm still going, I could hear it, but something in the sound of it was different, higher pitched, which means it's starting to blow itself out. Or could mean the opposite. In these hills you learn not to trust the sound. Clara was sitting on the floor near the hearth with Rose on a folded blanket in front of her, and she was talking to her in that way mothers talk to very small children, like they're continuing a conversation they started somewhere before either of them can remember. Rose had one fist closed around Clara's finger and was regarding it with profound seriousness. I sat up. Clara looked over. She said, "I'm sorry if she woke you." I said she didn't. That was true. I'd been half awake for a while, listening to them without meaning to. I got up and got the fire going again and put coffee on. Clara ate the food from the night before without embarrassment, which I respected. She was hungry, so she ate. Rose went asleep again on the blanket. We sat across the table with our coffee. The light outside the window was that flat white that means heavy cloud and probably more snow. I said, "What was your husband's name?" She said, Thomas Marsh. He was a cattleman, had a small place up near Ridgecroft. I said I knew him a little, bought a bull from him 3 years back. She looked at me. I said, "Roan bull, paid him $53 and he acted like I'd robbed him." Something moved in her face, not quite a smile, but near one. She said, "That sounds like Thomas." I said, "Good bull though." She nodded. She wrapped her hands around her cup. She said, "What is your name? I don't even know your name." I said, Callum Rays." She said it back to herself quietly, like she was placing it. She said, "Are you alone here?" I said, "Yes." She said, "How long?" I said, "Long enough." That was the end of that particular conversation, and she didn't push, which also I respected. I want to tell you what those days were, because it was 3 days as it turned out. The storm broke the morning of the 26th but left behind drifts that made the road to Harlow impassable for a wagon until the temperature came up enough to work with it, and I wasn't letting her go on foot, so 3 days. I want to tell you what they were because they're hard to explain, and I've tried to explain them to myself plenty of times since and mostly failed. I got up and did my work. That's what I did. I fed and watered the horses, which meant breaking ice in the trough twice a day. I brought in wood. I repaired the south window with rags and a wooden shim. I checked my cattle. I run about 40 head walking the fence line in snow up past my knees, making sure no one had gone through. Normal work. Work I'd done alone for years. But she was there when I came back in. She'd found the cornmeal and made Johnny cake the second morning without asking, just did it, and it was on the table when I came through the door stomping snow off my boots. She'd also fed the fire and swept the floor, which hadn't been swept since November at the outside. Rose was in a sling Clara had made out of a flour sack, asleep against her mother's chest, while Clara moved around the cabin like she'd been there before. I said, "You didn't have to do that." She said, "I know." I said, "The Johnny cake, I mean. You didn't, I wasn't expecting." She said, "Mr. Ray's. Sit down and eat." I sat down. The Johnny cake was good. I hadn't had anything I hadn't made myself in a very long time, and there's a difference, even if the ingredients are the same. There's something in food someone made for you that's different from food you made for yourself, and I'm not sure I can say what it is. A kind of attention, maybe. A kind of being thought about. I ate 2 pieces and didn't say much because I didn't trust what I might say. The second afternoon she asked if she could look at my books. I have maybe 20 books on a shelf above the window. Not much, I'm not a scholar, but I've kept them through every move and every hard year, and that shelf is one of the few things about this cabin I'm particular about. A few histories. A law book I've never entirely finished. A Bible I inherited from my father, who wasn't a particularly religious man but liked the language. A copy of Robinson Crusoe, so worn the spine is gone entirely. Some others. She stood on her toes a little to read the spines. Rose was asleep in the drawer I'd emptied and padded out, which was serving as a crib. Clara had her hair pinned back and she was wearing one of my shirts over her own dress because her coat was still drying and the cabin was warm but not that warm, and the shirt was too big for her by a country mile, the sleeves rolled up. She pulled out the Crusoe, turned it over in her hands, looked at me. She said, "You've read this a few times." I said, "A few." She said, "I read it when I was 12. I thought he was the bravest man I'd ever heard of." I said, "He makes a lot of mistakes." She said, "So does everyone." I said, "But he figures them out." She said, "Yes, he figures them out." She put it back carefully, both hands, like it was fragile, though it was long past fragile. She ran her finger along the other spines, pulled out the law book, raised an eyebrow at me. I said I had a land dispute. Years back, thought I should understand what I was dealing with. She said, "Did you win?" I said, "I kept my land, didn't I?" She smiled at that, a real one this time. It changed her face. I don't know when I started watching for it, that smile. It got to where I'd say something and wait to see if it landed, without being obvious about it. And when it did, there was a satisfaction in that I hadn't felt in. I don't have a number for that. A long time. The third night she put Rose down and we sat at the table with a lamp between us, and she asked me how I'd come to be here. Not in an intrusive way. In the way someone asks when they're genuinely curious, when they actually want the answer. I told her some of it, not all. I told her about coming out to the territory 15 years back with a partner and $40 between us. About the early years that were more failure than not. About my partner leaving when a better opportunity showed itself. About learning to run cattle alone. about losing a year's income to a summer that had no rain at all, and then another year to a disease that went through the herd, about building what I had now, which wasn't much but was mine. She listened the whole way through, all of it, didn't jump in when I paused, didn't nod too eagerly, just listened. When I finished, she said, "You built all of this by yourself." I said, "Most people out here built their own." She said, "I know, but you built it alone." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you stayed when things went bad." I said, "Where was I going to go?" She said, "A lot of men go somewhere. Thomas stayed too, but he had me. You," she stopped, she said, "I'm sorry, I don't mean to pry." I said, "You're not prying." She looked at her hands on the table. Outside, the wind had come down to almost nothing. Through the window I could see the first stars in days, hard and cold above the ridge. She said, "My sister in Harlow isn't expecting me. I wrote her, but I don't know if the letter got there. She has 4 children and a small house, and her husband works the mill. I'll be in the way. I know I'll be in the way." I said, "It's family." She said, "Yes, it's family." But she said it in a way that meant she knew what I meant, and knew it wasn't quite an answer, and was too tired and honest to pretend otherwise. I got up and poured us both more coffee. The lamp burned low. Rose slept. The ridge outside was still and white. I should tell you about the morning I knew. It was the 3rd morning, the 27th. I'd gone out early to check the road, testing the drifts, seeing if a wagon could get through yet. It was borderline. Another day of sun and it'd be passable. I came back in and she was at the hearth with her back to the door, and Rose was on the floor blanket again with that concentrated look she got, studying the world. Clara was doing something with the bacon, and she heard me come in and said, "How does it look?" without turning around, like she'd been expecting me back at exactly this time. And I stood in the doorway with snow on my coat thinking, this is what a house sounds like. I had lived in this cabin 8 years. I had built the table she was standing near. I had chiseled the fireplace lintel and hung that door and planed the floor. This was my house. I knew every sound it made, every draft, every way the light came through the east window in the morning at different times of year. But it hadn't sounded like this. Like someone was waiting for me to come back. I said, "Road might open tomorrow." She turned then. She looked at me. Something in her eyes, a searching or a reading, I couldn't tell which. Like she was checking something she'd suspected against what she actually saw. She said, "And you'll take me?" I said, "Yes." She nodded, turned back. After a moment she said, "Callum." It was the first time she'd used my given name. I noticed that. She said, "You didn't have to let me in. A lot of men wouldn't have." I said, "A lot of men are idiots." She made a sound, not quite a laugh, and shook her head. She kept her back to me, but I could see the line of her shoulders, and they were different than a minute ago. Softer, like something she'd been holding had been set down. I didn't sleep much that night. I won't dress it up. I lay there and I thought about the road opening and her in a wagon with Rose and her small bundle of things, and the road going north to Harlow, and I thought about the cabin after, which I could picture with perfect clarity. The drawer back in the chest, the flour sack washed and folded, the blanket folded, the chair near the hearth, just a chair again. I am 61 years old. I want to be accurate about that. A man of 61 who spent 30 of those years mostly alone has a settled relationship with solitude. It becomes something you rely on. It stops feeling like a lack and starts feeling like landscape, just the ground you live on. But she'd been here 3 days, and already I knew what the cabin would feel like without her. Already it was a different kind of quiet. I am not a man who talks about things like this easily. I am telling you because this is the truth of what happened, and the only way to tell the truth of it is to tell it. I got up at what must have been 3 in the morning and went to the table and sat there in the dark for a while. Not thinking, I was past thinking, just sitting. After a while, I got up and went to the window and looked out at the snowfield and the ridge and the stars. Behind me softly, Callum. I turned. She was sitting up on the bunk. She'd been taking the bunk. I'd been on the bedroll. Her insistence on that particular matter had been firm, and the firelight was low but enough. She had the blanket across her lap and Rose was asleep beside her, one small fist up beside her face. She said, "You can't sleep either." I said, "I'm fine." She said, "You're standing in the dark at 3 in the morning." I said, "I was just looking at the stars." She looked at me a long time, then she said, "Sit down, Callum." I sat in the chair I'd been sitting in for 3 days. She was maybe 10 feet away on the bunk. She said, "What is it?" I said, "Nothing." She said, "It's not nothing." I said, "Clara," and then I stopped because I didn't know what came after it. I knew what I wanted to say. I knew what was true. But I am not a man who says things like this, and I didn't know how to start, and I was afraid of how it would land, afraid it would change the thing that had been easy and natural in this cabin for 3 days and turn it into something strained and awkward, because that would be worse. The absence, I thought, would be better than the strained, awkward thing. She said, "Can I tell you something?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I have been alone since Thomas died. I don't mean the week since his death, though that's been—" She stopped, started again. "I mean alone the way you're alone when the person you made a life with is gone, and you're left standing in the middle of that life with no idea what any of it is for any more. I came out here because I had to go somewhere and my sister was somewhere. But I had no idea." She stopped again. She looked at Rose, looked back at me. She said, "I had no idea there was a man like you at the end of that fence line." The fire shifted, a log settled. I said, "Clara, I have nothing to offer you. I have 40 cattle and a sound roof and enough laid by to get through a bad winter, and that's about the sum of it." She said, "I know what you have." I said, "It's not." She said, "Callum, I have been watching you for 3 days. I watched you go out in weather that would have kept other men by the fire, twice a day, to take care of what was yours. I watched you chink a window because you could see Rose and I were cold. I watched you give up your bunk and not say a word about it. I watched you eat Johnny cake you didn't ask for and act like it was the finest thing you'd ever had." I said, "It was good Johnny cake." She said, "Stop." I stopped. She said, "I know what you have, Callum. I'm telling you I can see it. The kind of man you are. I could see it the minute you opened that door." She got up from the bunk. She came across the cabin, the fire throwing her shadow long against the wall, and she stood in front of me and looked down at me, and then she reached out and put her hand on the side of my face. Her hand was warm. She said, "I am not asking you for anything tonight. I'm not asking you for anything at all. I'm only telling you what I see so you know that someone sees it." I put my hand over hers, held it there. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Long enough that the fire burned down another inch. Long enough that Rose stirred once and settled again. Finally I said, "Stay." She didn't answer right off. I said, "Not for tonight, I mean stay, here. If you want to, you don't have to go to Harlow if you don't want to go to Harlow." She looked at me with those serious eyes, reading me again. She said, "You know what that would look like, to people." I said, "I know." She said, "People would talk." I said, "Let them." She said, "You'd have a woman and a baby in your house. Your whole life changes." I said, "Clara, my whole life changed 3 days ago. I'm just asking you to stay in it." Something in her face came apart a little. Not in a breaking way, in a loosening way. Like something braced too long finally let go. She took her hand from my face, and I thought for a moment. But then she put both arms around my neck and put her head down on my shoulder, and I sat there with my hands on her back and Rose asleep in the bunk, and the last of the Christmas fire burning to coals. She didn't go to Harlow. I went to Harlow. Rode up 2 days later to explain things to her sister, which was a conversation I will not pretend was easy. The sister looked at me with eyes that would have done credit to a prosecuting judge, and I told her straight. Clara was safe, Clara was well, the baby was well, I had a sound place and enough to provide, and it was Clara's choice to make. The sister said, "And what exactly are your intentions?" I said, "My intentions are to ask her to marry me if she'll have me, and in the meantime to make sure she and that child are warm and fed and not on the road alone in winter." The sister looked at me another long minute. Then she said, "All right," she said, "if Clara is content, then I'm content." I rode back through the snow with that verdict, and a jar of her sister's apple preserves that had been pressed into my hand at the door, which I took as a good sign. Clara laughed when I came in and she saw the jar. She took it from me and held it up to the lamplight, and she was laughing and I was watching her laugh, and Rose was in her drawer studying the ceiling, and the fire was good. She married me in April. The circuit preacher. 12 people there, neighbors, a few from Harlow, her sister's family. It was cold still, but the ground was starting to show through the snow, and there were crocuses coming up along the south side of the barn that I hadn't planted and didn't know were there. Somebody at the wedding said to me, "You always seemed like a man who had everything settled. I never knew you were lonely." I said, "Neither did I." That was 22 years ago now. The cabin's not the same cabin. We added on twice. There's a proper bedroom, and a room that was Rose's until she left for school in Cheyenne, and a kitchen that actually has a stove instead of a fireplace, and bookshelves on 2 walls instead of one because Clara has more books than I do by a considerable margin, and they needed somewhere to live. The 40 cattle are 96. We had 3 bad years in a row in the 90s, drought, then price collapse, then a hard winter, and there were nights I lay awake running numbers and they didn't add up, and I'd get up and go to the kitchen and she'd be there already, because she was running the same numbers, and we'd sit at the table together and figure out what to cut and what to hold and what to sell, and she'd put the pencil down and say, "We'll be all right." Just that. Not a question. A statement of intention. We were all right. Rose is grown. She teaches school in Cheyenne and writes long letters home that make Clara laugh and sometimes cry. She's got her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and I mean her actual father Thomas, because you can see it in her, and I don't mind that. Thomas Marsh was a decent man who left a decent family, and it wasn't his fault about the fever. I'm 61 now. I keep trying to account for these years and I can't quite do it. They went and I was in them and I am still in them. Christmas Eve comes around and I remember that knock on the door. I remember the blue dark and the snow in her hair, and the baby inside her coat looking up at me like I was about to decide something that mattered. I remember that I almost didn't open the door. I almost let the knocking go. Every year I think about that. I got up and went to the door because the knock sounded like a hand with nothing left in it. That's the only reason. Not nobility, I'm not a noble man. I just heard it and recognized it for what it was. And then I let her in, and she let me in, and what came after was a whole life. There's no way to put that and have it sound like what it actually is. 40 cattle to 96. 1 daughter in Cheyenne. Books on 2 walls. A woman who still gets up in the night to run numbers when things are bad and then says we'll be all right like it's a fact she's already checked. Last night she was reading by the lamp, and I came in from the barn and she looked up and there it was. That same look I'd first seen by the fire on Christmas Eve, the one I couldn't quite name. I know what it is now. I've had 22 years to figure it out. She looks at me like I'm the thing that held. Like the whole of it, the snow, the grief, the road she walked 4 miles in the dark, Rose growing up in a room we built for her, the bad years we got through together, everything that came after held because of him. Because of this man she saw through a door. I set my coat on the peg. I sat down across from her. The lamp between us, same as always. Outside, snow just starting, I'd seen it coming in from the ridge, that particular gray. The gray that is weight. And I was not afraid of winter.